Welcome to the next lesson in this chapter, where we are going to discuss distributed tracing using OpenTelemetry and how this helps us improve the observability of our system. Let's first explain what is OpenTelemetry. It's an open source standard for instrumenting your applications. OpenTelemetry provides us with a set of tools for creating and managing telemetry data, and this includes application traces, metrics, and logs. Inside of this lesson, I will not be focusing on every little detail about OpenTelemetry. Instead, I want to focus on the practical implementation and instrumenting our .NET Core applications. If you want to learn more about OpenTelemetry, I'm going to leave some learning resources under this video. And now let's take a look at a diagram representing the OpenTelemetry ecosystem. And we are going to start from the microservices component, although this could also be our monolith application. And here we can introduce OpenTelemetry automatic instrumentation, or using the OpenTelemetry APIs and SDKs that are available inside of .NET as NuGet packages. Our services or applications are going to produce a lot of telemetry data, and this information is going to be exported to an OpenTelemetry collector. This collector can then push this data into a time series database, trace databases, or column stores, where we can essentially implement an observability frontend and gain some further insights from all of the telemetry data that we are producing. Other than our services, our infrastructure components can also produce telemetry data, and this could be Kubernetes, any reverse proxies we might have, cloud services we might be using, as well as databases, message queues, and other external APIs that we could be depending on. All of this is going to produce telemetry data that can be pushed to an OpenTelemetry collector, and then the collector can distribute this data to any services that know how to process this information and present it in a user-friendly way. What we are going to be doing inside of our system is introducing OpenTelemetry and configuring some instrumentation libraries, and then we're going to introduce Jaeger, which is an open source distributed tracing platform. We're going to configure OpenTelemetry to push our application traces to Jaeger, and then we will be able to observe these traces and gain some additional insights about our system. Now I'm going to show you a few distributed traces that were captured from the Jaeger user interface. And here you can see a post request to the user's register endpoint. And if we follow this request, you will see that it's hitting the gateway service, which we are going to introduce in one of the next lessons. And this service is proxying the request to our Evently API. The API itself is going to do a few requests here, which involves talking with Keycloak, which is our external identity provider, and we will be able to see this in our distributed traces. Finally, it's going to write some data into the database before completing the request and returning the response to the user. The next distributed trace I want to show you is publishing a user-registered integration event, and here you can see the system has two API services, the Evently API and Evently Ticketing API, and we can track how we are sending our integration event and then consuming it from the distributed services that we have inside of our system. So this is a very good example of how distributed tracing can give you some visibility into what is going on inside of your system. When you think about it, we have three independent operations here, sending an integration event from one of our services, and then we have two operations for consuming this event in the other services in our system. And the last example I want to show you before we dive into the implementation is a more complicated distributed trace that involves quite a few operations inside of our system. You can see we are hitting the gateway, which is then proxying the request to our ticketing API, which is then communicating with the other API in our system using distributed messaging. All of this we are going to implement in the upcoming lessons, and for now let's jump into the code and introduce OpenTelemetry and distributed tracing with Jaeger. Let's start by introducing and configuring OpenTelemetry into our application. And since this is a cross-cutting concern that applies to all of our modules, we're going to implement it inside of the common infrastructure project. And I will start by installing some additional NuGet packages into our system. Let's look for OpenTelemetry, and here you can see a range of NuGet packages that we can introduce into our application. I'm going to install a few of them, and let's start with OpenTelemetry Extensions Hosting. This is going to help us run a background service that we can use for producing our traces and metrics. Then I'm going to install the OpenTelemetry exporter, and this is going to allow me to export OpenTelemetry traces into Jaeger. Then I'm going to add some instrumentation packages, and instrumentation packages help us to configure OpenTelemetry tracing with the various components inside of our system. So this is an instrumentation for the HTTP client. Let's also add instrumentation for ASP.NET Core. Then I'm going to look for the MPG SQL OpenTelemetry package. And this is going to instrument our MPG SQL library, which we are using in our EF Core queries, as well as our SQL queries with Dapr. Let's also look for a Redis package for OpenTelemetry, and I'm going to look for OpenTelemetry Redis, and you may have to include pre-release packages to be able to see all of them. So I'm going to install OpenTelemetry Instrumentation Stack Exchange Redis. So let's go ahead and add the latest version, and now I'm going to look for NAD Framework Instrumentation, and I'm also going to install the latest version of the EF Core Instrumentation package. So with our OpenTelemetry packages installed, which you can see here, we can go ahead and configure OpenTelemetry from the common infrastructure project, and then we will be able to use this from all of our modules. So let's close this down, and let me open up the infrastructure configuration class. And you will see just how easy it is to configure tracing with OpenTelemetry. So I'm going to say services, add OpenTelemetry, and this is going to introduce some base services that we are going to need. Then I'm going to say configure resource, and I'm going to provide an action to configure some initial information. And what I want to say is call add service and give a name to the service that we are running here. So this is going to be Evently, representing our application, but we could also call it Evently API because we will introduce another service later into this chapter. Another recommendation would be to pass this through some argument. So let's instead call this the service name, and I'm going to pass this value from the add infrastructure call. So right after the service collection, let's introduce a string representing the service name. We're going to provide the value for the service name later. Let's go back to our OpenTelemetry configuration. The next thing I need to do is to configure tracing. And I can do this by calling with tracing and providing a delegate for the tracer builder provider. So I'm going to say with tracing, and then let's go ahead and configure the instrumentations from the NuGet packages that we just installed. So I'm going to say add ASP.NET Core instrumentation, and then I'm going to configure the HTTP client instrumentation, the EF Core instrumentation, the Redis instrumentation, the MPG SQL instrumentation. If some of the existing NuGet packages that we have support tracing, we can also configure that here. And an example of that would be mass transit, where we can say add source and then specify mass transit. And I'm going to look for logging diagnostic headers, and then I can specify the default listener name. And this is going to introduce traces from mass transit. So we automatically configure tracing for ASP.NET Core requests, HTTP client requests, EF Core commands, Redis commands, MPG SQL commands, and anything that has to do with mass transit. And now that we are producing a bunch of traces, we need to export them somehow. So I'm going to say traces, add OTLP exporter. And this is going to configure a trace exporter to a particular destination that we can configure through application settings. When we set the value for the environment variable, it's going to point to the Jaeger instance that we will be running. So this is all that's required to set up OpenTelemetry and configure a bunch of instrumentations. Now let's go ahead and provide our service name from the call to add infrastructure. Now what I could do here is say Evently API, but the recommended approach is introducing a constant that's going to contain your OpenTelemetry data. So I'm going to create a folder inside of the Evently API project, and I will call it OpenTelemetry. Inside of it, I'm going to introduce a new class, and I'm going to call this the diagnostics config. And this is going to be a public and static class with one string constant inside that's going to be my service name. And let's call this the Evently API. And now what I can do is pass this value for the service name for OpenTelemetry. So let me say diagnostics config, and let's pass in the service name. Another thing we could do is to hook into some existing cross-cutting concerns that we have and introduce some additional telemetry data. What I have in mind is going to the request logging pipeline behavior that we implemented as a cross-cutting concern in the common application project. And what we can do here is introduce some tags on the current diagnostics activity. What I want to do is say activity, and this is going to import this system diagnostics namespace, and then I can try to access the current activity if it exists. If it does exist, I want to set a tag on this activity, which is a key value pair, and for example I can say request module and pass in the module name, and let's also pass in the request name for the current activity. So I will say request name, and this is going to include the values of these two tags on the OpenTelemetry traces that we are going to be exporting to Jaeger. And we will be able to see which modules our traces are coming from, and also what is the request that was included in a specific trace. And remember that our traces could be both commands and queries inside of our system, so this is going to give us some additional contextual information. Let me close this down. And then another thing I want to do is to introduce an additional middleware component into the Evently API project. You can grab the source code for this middleware right under this video, but you will see that it's very simple. I introduced the log context trace logging middleware, and what we're going to do here is take the trace ID from the current activity, if it exists, and then I'm going to push this value into the log context as an additional property called trace ID.